and thank you for being today with us. It's really nice to see you, so many people here today. My name is Xenia Capacete Caballero from White Line Projects Studio, and we curated the exhibition Mundo Latinx, which is on now at Fashion Space Gallery until the 4th of May. So today's event, Indigenous World's Representation, Inclusivity, and Empowerment Within Fashion, is the first event of the exhibitions program. So keep an eye on the Fashion Space Gallery website for more events coming up soon. This panel discussion coincides with the British Council's International Fashion Showcase at Somerset House, and it's going to be open until 24th of February. So I really encourage you to go there if you haven't already. And we invited two great practitioners that are part of this year's International Fashion Showcase, Laura Lawrence and Curtis Oland. And we are going to be discussing a very poignant topic, Indigenous communities through and within fashion. And we have chairing the panel discussion, Dr. Elizabeth Kutesko. Hi. Dr. Kutesko is lecturer in cultural studies at Central St. Martin's. She's author of Fashion in Brazil, Globalization and the Representation of Brazilian Dress in National Geographic, and has published an article based upon her research in the Brazilian Fashion Special Edition of Fashion Theory in 2016. Her research interests are Latin American bodily practices and the intersection between fashion, cultural identity, representation, and power. Joining the discussion is designer Laura Lawrence. She debuted her label in Paris in 2013 with a special capsule collection, Spring-Summer 14, made entirely from a stock of Colombian military fabrics. Since 2016, she has also been working as the creative director of New York-based brand Cavo. I don't know if I pronounced it well. Yeah. Lauren's collection frequently deal with duality, contradiction, and conflict, influenced by the ongoing collaboration with the Emberas trans community artisans and their indigenous heritage. And finally, joining today's discussion is fashion designer and artist Curtis Oland from Canada and now based in London. Curtis completed his studies in fashion design at Ryerson University in 2016, and later that summer won the Emerging Menswear Designer Award at Toronto's Men's Fashion Week Spring-Summer 17 with his collection Oyama Lake. His work focuses on raw use of material, utilizing soft tailoring, organic forms, earthen tones, and a genderless mindset. His connection to his indigenous Lil'wat heritage and his love for the supernatural aspects of his homeland are driving forces in his creative process. So thank you so much for being with us today. Let the conversation begin. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, it's on.
Okay, so I don't know how many of you have seen the exhibition Mundo Latinx, but hopefully you're aware that it's essentially about challenging stereotypes of Latin America, and I suppose kind of providing different narratives or different histories about the world through fashion. And I think that this is really kind of relevant to both of your work, because you're both concerned with identity, and this also kind of plays a role in the displays that you have at the International Fashion Showcase at the moment. So I thought maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. And perhaps it makes sense to start with you, Laura, given that you're Colombian, and then can move on to Curtis. So what role does identity play in your work?
Well, I think as a Colombian, when you go like somewhere, everyone is like, oh, Colombian, and they know just about like drugs, mafia, nasty things. So it's part of the story, but it's not the only part of being Colombian. So I think through fashion, I actually study arts. And when I started doing pieces, I said, okay, what can I do with what I have in my country? In Colombia, we don't have access like to fancy fabrics or like all the European heritage. So I said, I really like to work with things that I've seen a lot, but maybe we start not seeing anymore because we normalize them as all the stuff about the military fabrics and all the leftovers of the conflict. So what I started doing was to like how to recompose that identity and how to twist those things into something else. So we work with the fabrics and how to, for example, in one collection we use bullets and then we make pieces of jewelry with pearls. So all the time, like how to take something from one side and the other and how to like make another lecture of it. Mm-hmm. And in that way, I think it's the construction of identity and how to, because like our culture is so stigmatized in many ways, how to, through creativity and creative processes, how to like turn things into another direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how does that kind of play out in your work as well?
Identity. Yeah, I think when I really started to think about my work seriously while I was in school and how I want to, in school you're developing your aesthetic and your artistic direction. And I started thinking about identity a lot because in Canada we are, we're an extremely diverse nation. And me coming from so a multicultural, a multi-heritage background and trying to understand my own identity and where I fit in Canadian culture and how do I navigate that and how do I represent myself and how to talk about myself and my work and the inspirations. And so I grew up on the West Coast in the Okanagan Valley, and on my mother's side, she's Lil'wat First Nation, and so that means I'm of course Lil'wat as well. And so growing up with that family and learning the teachings and having access to the cultural heritage, continuously through my childhood and into my adult life, really shaped me in my core belief systems and the ways that I connect to the land and to other people and to my artistic practice. And as I became, as I grew up, I realized the importance of being a representative of my Indigenous heritage, because every experience being an Indigenous person is different, and there's a huge sense of diaspora within people of Indigenous heritage because of the trauma that our ancestors have gone through, and my mother or my grandmother taken from her family and put into a residential school and told not to speak her language and not to practice her culture. So she was sort of forced to assimilate into this Western world, and for a lot of people that culture is lost, or there's we have small bits of it that we have access to, and so a lot of us have to do a lot of work to rediscover that and to become culture carriers, because it's very important that continues. So yeah, for me it's about my journey, trying to insert myself into the environments and connections, connect with my community back home, and learn as much as I can so that I can pass that knowledge on later in life.
Yeah, and I think that's super interesting because I think that something we were talking about earlier was sort of how do you navigate that kind of fine line between empowering the kind of communities that you're working with and I suppose appropriating them in some way. And I think that this kind of comes in both of your work, you know? So how do you kind of negotiate that within your work?
Well, I think that one of the things that I've been discovering working with these minority groups as the ex-convicts of my country and the trans Indigenous community is that we are always kind of worried about being part of something instead of building. When you go to the community, for example, and it's a dialogue, a conversation, it becomes like circular, and you don't cross that line that can be like, because maybe you want to be like inclusive, and then you end up being super exclusive, because sometimes you are like looking like in a privileged position. So I was really aware about that, and when I went there, everything started as a friendship. And then I said, okay, through the work and the collections, how can I build with them? Not like, because I think it's not only about what they have learned about my creative process, but instead is like from their side to my side. And I think that's like the way that you can build, like, because when you work with vulnerable communities, I really didn't want to be like, to cross that line, you know? So I think it's just to be like how to be, make a conversation, a dialogue, and how to, it's both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a really important word, because I suppose like dialogue and collaboration is sort of what this is all about, because you're kind of trying to give voice to, I suppose, identities that haven't been heard before. But then there's always like the risk of, are you like speaking for them? Are you projecting like your own ideas onto them? And then you're kind of back to the whole like history.
Totally. That's one of the reasons that for the IFS project, I didn't want to like represent them, because they have like their own universe, their own aesthetics, their own voice. So 2 members of the community came here. They traveled with me as representation of the other members of the community. And some of the images that are there, it's a co-creation with them here. And so...
Yeah, maybe actually, I don't know if any of you have seen the display. It's part of, it's called Brave New World. It's part of the International Fashion Showcase. It opened 2 days ago, and your project is called Wraparound.
Yeah.
Maybe you can just tell them a little bit more about that.
Well, the idea of Wraparound, it was like something like that space where you can, I really wanted to show like the behind the scenes of clothes, like all these layers that when you buy something, you buy more. Sorry, I'm doing like this, and it was, you're buying more than your clothes. And Wraparound was like this way of fixing, holding, and like this dynamic circularity. So if you have the opportunity to go there, you'll see that the structure and the installation, it's, you can see through, you can go from here to there. There is not like a pyramid, like it's not like this, it's not it's
pyramid.
Exactly.
Okay, you mean it's not a hierarchy.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So that's the idea of Wraparound, how all these threads and how everything is like interconnected, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to kind of think about identities, you know, as not being sort of static and fixed in particular locations, but kind of constantly being...
Totally, and
yeah.
when you are working with a transgender group, I didn't want to be like to make something that was like dualistic. I wanted like really how to be like the fluidity in the whole process. And because one of the challenges of working with a community is that sometimes idealize like Indigenous as if they lived like in 19th century, and it's amazing because if you know the girls in the exhibition, you'll see that they have their mobile phone, they love to make selfies. It's like they have access to, it's one world, it's not like two different worlds. So in a way, I didn't want to be idealize like this and a romantic point of view about being an Indigenous. It like been how to be honest and how they really, it was all about like honesty with them. It wasn't like because they have access to a lot of things, even though this is the first time that they travel in their life, but information, and it's one world, is like, it's not like...
Yeah, and I think that's super important, like thinking that, we are not kind of situating Indigenous peoples into a kind of like imposed ethnographic present where you kind of recognize they're in the present, but you're kind of always talking about them as though they're in the past.
Totally.
Yeah, and I think that that's really relevant to your work, because you have this kind of, I think you talk about like a modern indigenous, how do you say that?
Indigeneity?
Yeah, like, do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
kind of bringing the two together. So maybe you can say a little bit.
Yeah, I think part of the reason of me wanting to come to London and to Europe to start the conversation over here is because there is a lot of misconceptions of what it means to be Indigenous, and there is more often a very stereotyped understanding of who we are as people. And you know, the group that I've been collaborating with, we want to challenge that notion of a homogenized indigeneity. They think we're all the same, we're all one culture, which is absolutely the direct opposite. We all have different languages. We come from very, distant parts of the continent, and we have different belief systems and different practices, and they look different. Their art and their craft is different, and but like Laura was saying about, they're on their phones. They have that connection to the modern world. We're all still modern people, and our culture evolves and our practices evolve, just how any other artist in the world would operate. And so the way we wanted to present our work, we were very conscious of performing Indigenous for the audience. And we wanted to, this is for us. This project is about like what we're doing, and what, like, it's not like for anyone else other than ourselves. And if you go see the exhibit and look at the film that we created, and the garments and the installation, we reference traditional art and practices in different parts of our own culture, but it's subtle. It's we feed it in very selective ways. So and then in the film you are kind of we kind of leave it up to the audience a little bit to do some of the work to try to understand what's happening. We don't feed it too directly, and we actually, there's points in the film where you don't really understand what's going on. You want to get up a little closer. You want it to be spelled out for you, but we don't do that because we are kind of keeping it close to us. But the artists I've selectively, I wanted to work with them specifically because their work does, it has that, it fits in the modern world very well, and it has those strains of tradition, but it's abstracted, and it has many layers to it, which makes it really exciting and really cool.
So this is the film produced that accompanies the, is it 6 or 7? 6 outfits?
6, yeah, there's 6.
In delicate tissue. Is the film, can we see was the film up
Yeah,
there?
I sent the film.
Is it, can I pause it on the film clip? Oh, and then,
Is there sound that we can play too? Oh, there it is, yeah.
How long is the film as a whole?
So we've created a structure and we've projected it onto this stretched canvas structure that goes straight up. It's almost like a shape of a tree. And yeah. So the film itself is on a 12-minute loop, and what we also wanted to share with the audience, and thinking of Canada and the land that we come from, and what's one of the most powerful things that we get to experience every day being in Canada is the landscape, and what we share, the shared belief system and that is deeply rooted in tradition is our connection to the land, that spiritual and sacred exchange that you have with the land, and what you take from it and what you give back to it, and it's a part of us. We are part of it, and if people haven't had the opportunity to visit Canada, everyone says, Western Canada especially, you go into the mountains, you have mountains, you have giant trees, the cedar rainforest, you have the ocean, you just have all this beauty in front of you, and so we really wanted to bring that into the space and kind of create this sort of meditative connection for the viewers, and to just kind of have, just to breathe and relax, but it kind of has this sort of dreamscape feel to it, or we shot with two fisheye lens cameras, and some of the footage is also done with a GoPro, so it's like first person, kind of journeying through the wilderness, through the mountains, and then we've abstracted it and kind of edited it together to have this sort of the narrative doesn't. There is a sort of a narrative, but it doesn't quite have a start or a finish.
I like that, because
Yeah.
it's kind of, it's a bit deconstructed,
Yeah.
It's making you think a bit more. And I think the thing that I really liked about looking at your work was this idea that I felt that you were giving us a different understanding of time. So, I think the kind of global fashion industry, we tend to have this idea, is seasonal, it's centered on Paris, Milan, London, New York. It's continually moving very, very quickly. And I felt that in your work, you were kind of giving us a different perspective. You were kind of questioning that sort of very fast narrative of change that we've come to know as fashion, and suggesting maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe we actually, in order to have a kind of sustainable, holistic fashion system, we need to rethink all of that. And it reminded me of something that the anthropologist Joanne Eicher said. She was writing about fashion, and she said something like, fashion is about change, however small. And change happens in every culture. And I thought that was just a really nice way of kind of rethinking how we understand, what we understand fashion to be. Because I feel like sustainability is quite sort of a big thing within your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of the biggest message I'm trying to put across. And when people ask about my work, and sometimes they mistakenly say that I do traditional Indigenous design, which it's what I'm taking from my heritage, my culture is that it's more conceptual. It's more about the belief system and that connection to land and to materiality, and that just Indigenous people have always been conscious of sustainability and your connection to the environment and how you treat it. And so they honor everything that they take from the land, and they don't take more than what they need. And so that message is constant throughout my work. And so delicate tissue is about that precarious relationship we have with nature, especially today. What we're doing to the environment is dangerously close to destroying all of us. We're talking about global warming, climate change. Like, you know, we're at that kind of pinnacle of, you know, we can either, you know, keep going and, you know, end it all, or we can, you know, turn around and start to think about it differently. Because, you know, it's a little bit existential, I guess, when I talk about this, but it's like the planet will still be here with or without us. So if, like, we can, you know, if we want to stay here and continue, you know, the planet doesn't care if we're here or not, right? It'll, you know, millennia will go by and it'll heal itself. And, you know, like, our bodies are borrowed from the land, and, like, you know, we want to maintain that relationship. So that's why it's called delicate tissue, because we are delicate. Everything is delicate in that relationship. But I'm also tying it into relationships with one another. I'm trying to think of, like, how do I connect to people coming into this space, and you know, that relationship that I'm creating with all of us, because it's, you know, it's all a cultural exchange, and it's constantly evolving.
That's really, that's so interesting. Does sustainability play a part in your work at all?
Yeah, totally. Because I think that when you work, for example, with the community, they were losing their heritage, because to be an indigenous in Colombia is not easy at all. So the craft, the beadswork that they do identifies them, is like the traditional part that they have. So they reject it in a way. And when we start working together, they kind of start understanding that it can also dignify, that work dignify, and will give, like, a lot of improvements to their community. So they, like, take it again and empower themselves with the work. So I think sustainability, it's also about circular economy, and how, if we start, like, working in all these levels, it's sustainable, because we are, like, and actually, well, my brand is a commercial brand. Some of the pieces that are there are commercial, show pieces, but we have a business, and a part of what I like about this kind of idea of sustainability is that you can do it. You can implement this kind of practices into a brand, into a business. So, and in the other hand, we try to work, like, eco-dyeing, working with the leftovers. So I think in that way, you're never gonna be, like, completely sustainable, because it's impossible. But I think this kind of projects of co-creations with communities, like being a bit more conscious, it's totally, like, in the core of the brand, and it's possible to do it. And I think that when someone, like, buys a piece and it has, like, this handcraft work, and you see that each piece is different from the other and have, like, this uniqueness and all this story behind, I think it, maybe in another level, can create conscience in the people that wear it. You are wearing another skin. So it's like what I was telling about, like, the circular economy, that I think is sustainable in a way, because you have something else. We were talking before about, like, in a world with overconsumism, there is a loss of meaning in everything, because it's so much of everything that, like, the meaning is kind of. But I think this way of working, it's a way of, like, to give meaning again to things. So you don't need that much.
Yeah.
In a way, because it becomes, like, powerful pieces. And for Indigenous, in this Emberachami, each of the patterns that they design, it's also kind of a shamanistic, how do you say that? Shamanic, like a shamanic, like it has a power, a shamanic power. You can say that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a shamanic power. So it's also a way to protect and to communicate. So it's like all these paradoxes about like what is inside, it's outside, and how. So yeah, I think it's sustainable in that whole sense.
Okay, no, that's that makes a lot of sense. And I was just thinking, does kind of copyright or intellectual property, has that ever kind of come into this, like the way when you're working with these communities? Have there ever been any kind of tensions about?
Well, no, we've been working together for 2 years, and no, because. For example, some of the pieces that we are co-creating here, they just bring like their pieces, and then we start working together, and I'm the editor of those pieces from pieces. And in the other hand, I've been developing some patterns in my studio, and then they make the interpretation, and the dialogue is like clear. So we've never have like this kind of. I think it's also about like honesty with when you are like making the deal, like in a way, like when you are talking together, is like it's never been something that I feel like is.
Yeah, we were talking about this, weren't we? Like that it was not a kind of one-way narrative of you sort of saying, do that, like, but much more kind of debate, exchange, collaboration.
Totally.
And I think that's. And I suppose like that's the whole kind of way of solving or starting to solve the kind of issue of cultural appropriation. It's really about not just going into a community and grabbing something, but it's about kind of maybe working with the community, making sure that they, that they're represented, that they receive some of the profits, in order to kind of get away from that. Do you ever have to kind of be careful in your work about what you take, how you represent?
Yeah, I think it's in the beginning I really thought long and hard of how I want to access my heritage, because I'm very well aware of how fair I am and how people perceive me when they look at me. And I present myself as an Indigenous person. Some people have, like I said, these preconceived notions of what it means to be a modern Indigenous person. And it's, on both sides, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have different opinions of accessing the culture. But the way I present myself in my work and my research and the end result of what I present, I am very careful of what I am taking from the culture, from tradition, and the avenues through which I can receive those things. Like a lot of people think that, oh well, you're Indigenous, you're allowed to go do whatever you want, and I kind of object to that because I have been, I've suffered from that diaspora and that loss of culture. My family has, we're inserted in it in some ways. Very like I'm kind of like on this bridge. I feel like where in some ways I've experienced a lot, but in some ways I'm missing out on a lot of it as well. And so I could open up a book and look at traditional beadwork, and I know how to do bead embroidery, but to me, I don't want to utilize that part of the craft, the art, by researching through a book. Like what I want to do is go into the mountains with my cousin and spend a month there and have him teach me how to do how he does his beadwork, and sort of have him pass on that knowledge to me, so then I become a carrier of that knowledge, and I can then pass it on to someone else. So accessing these these traditions. It's a sacred exchange. It's like an ongoing spiritual experience that, to me, that's how I have to go about it. Because I have presented work before, and people come up to me and they're all like, what are you doing? They try to accuse me of
not being indigenous.
Yeah, and like I'm doing cultural, appropriating indigenous culture, and so it's like, I don't know, it's tense, but it's, you have to just approach it really calmly and kind of explain, and so I'm very conscious of how I'm presenting myself this way.
No, that makes a lot of sense. But actually, one thing I kept thinking was, how do you negotiate that living in London? Because weirdly, when I've been away from the UK, I've kind of felt more British somehow by being surrounded by people that weren't British in a way that I've never felt when I'm here. Because I feel that identity is all about, there's no kind of fixed cultural identity. It's all about kind of insider and outsider understandings of it. And often it's about interaction with other people that make you feel kind of more or less in some way. I mean, this kind of applies to both of you, I suppose. What's it like working in London but connecting with a cultural identity that's kind of far away? I mean, you're based in Bogota, but you've been here.
Yeah, totally. But I think when you work as a designer, you become like a bridge in a way for what you're saying. So yeah, if you're in Bogota, I don't feel like Colombiana because I'm all surrounded by Colombianos. But then when I go to the community, I'm not, maybe I have some DNA, but I'm not indigenous. And then you come here. And yeah, identity is also about, you discover what you are when you are surrounded by people that are the same at the end, but yeah, it's what you're saying. So in a way, I think you are like a bridge, and it's like how to make that line together.
Yeah, and I feel that fashion's kind of the perfect medium because it is transnational, it crosses borders. You can't, you might buy a t-shirt in London, but it will have traveled all around the world before it came to you. And what about you? How does that kind of play out? How do you negotiate, connecting with home when you're here? I suppose here is home.
Yeah, I've been here over a year now, and I think I'm still figuring it out, but it's, for me, what's so important is connecting to land and to the environment and to nature. And it's difficult to be in London. It's layers upon layers upon layers of civilizations that London's been around thousands of years. So that trying to find land and connect to it is kind of have to go out of it. There's lots of green space, but it feels very, compared to, I'm from the wilderness, what is untouched territory and mountain ranges of it. But I think presenting myself as Indigenous over here in London is interesting because there's people don't understand what that means a lot of the time, and so it's kind of interesting to be able to begin educating people, or they have an interest in what that means, and maybe they have a preconceived notion of what that is, and what a stereotypical idea of what it is. So
yeah, go on.
Yeah, and maybe the thing about clothes and garments is that you buy something because you like it. Maybe you don't know all the story behind, but the interesting thing is that maybe one day you buy a dress and then you realize in the secret tag or when you're doing the laundry, all these layers that are behind the garment. And that's what I like also about the fashion or the garments is that maybe sometimes we are obsessed with identifying ourselves with something and then realize that is much, like there is no that limit, that you, like to have a cloth for a designer from another part, how many like stages that it has to travel to be there, and then you put it. So it's like skin over skin over skin, and that's something that I love about like these like involving projects. That is, it's not just one thing. It's not like I'm Laura, I'm Colombian, I'm so many other things. You know, like it's not only, I work with Indigenous, and it's not only that. It's like you are making like a constant reinterpretation of your homeland, but then you are not only your homeland. You are like a sponge, and you have so many other information as the Indigenous. You know, like when I'm with her, I'm like, what? For example, one of the girls, her name is Gina, and I asked her, why did your name is Gina? And she was like, no, because there's a character from X-Men called Gina, and she was obsessed with her. And I was like, how? You know, they live like in the mountain chain of Los Andes. It's like a really hard place to go into. And she knew about Gina from X-Men. Yes, so I was like, how? And then that's like what I also like about like this kind of the clothes in a way. Like it's like so many, and it's more than one thing.
Yeah, like I think that's for some reason, this is how the industry has, like the regulations when you put your clothes out on the market, and they, you know, all you get is a tag that says made in wherever, made in England, made in Bangladesh, made in China. And that's all the information you get about the story of that garment, of where it's come from, because, you know, the cotton for that T-shirt maybe didn't come from Bangladesh, but it was sent there. You know, like we're not being honest about all the different places these pieces come from, and I think that, you know, I think people want to know where, you know, who has touched these materials, or who's grown these materials, who's woven these materials, where have all these places, where has it landed, and had some kind of process done to it, and then ultimately it's put together in some country, and then that's what's put on the label. But I think to tell that story is, I think people want to know that. I definitely would love to know that.
Yeah, because it's kind of unraveling, different narrative of the items that, like, made in Bangladesh or wherever doesn't kind of adequately, tell the story. What else was I going to ask you? Maybe you could just say something. Like, I was just interested, what's the kind of role of, like the Colombian government? Do they support the sorts of projects that you're engaged in, or like just out of interest?
Well, at the beginning, it was kind of difficult, because in a way, when like you are looking for the support of public money, they want to have an image like really like idealistic, you know, like they don't want, okay, let's talk about Indigenous, but maybe not transgender, you know, like, no, and they're pretty conservative, so, but it was funny because when we were selected by IFS, in a way, when you are, they accept like the project, then it's like a, like, okay,
pat on the back.
Like, okay, England, okay, okay, maybe. So they start hearing me. And there was something like the project in many levels. I didn't know that it has like some political consequences. And then, for example, the organization that supports like the craft and the Indigenous and artisans in my country, it's almost a ministry. They were not aware about the LGBT community from the Indigenous communities. So with the project, they were like, Laura, this is amazing. We didn't know about that, so we start working together, like for the rights, because they've been like really like well, they didn't know about them in a way. So So that's what we were talking about, like all these other levels that can happen with a project that I didn't know it can be like go that deep. I end up like talking with the Ministry of Commerce. I don't know, like, you know, and you're like a designer and you don't know like how deep it can go until like all these, things can happen, and it's like the garments becomes like a space of encounter, like intersection space. So in the beginning they were like she's weird. What is she doing, and why she goes and make workshops with the ex-combats of the guerrilla, and why she works with these people from Indigenous but then. You start finding people that supports that kind of projects, and then when another country is interested in, maybe it's like a
validation of some sort. No, that's so interesting. And what about the Canadian government? Are they kind of okay? Because we were saying there's now this Indigenous Fashion Week set up in Toronto. Is that kind of a government backed in any way, or?
So it depends on which province you're in. So Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto is in Ontario. They actually just had some new law, like they've just voted in a very conservative provincial government that is stripping funding for the arts, and specifically Indigenous arts. So it's regressing a little bit, which is kind of scary. So that happened right after Indigenous Fashion Week. That was in June this year, 2018.
Yeah.
But on the other end of the country, like in my province, British Columbia, where like in Vancouver, there's a bit more funding for arts, and there's a bit more of sort of revival and support for Indigenous art and culture in general. But from my perspective, as I work in a fashion sphere, fashion isn't really considered art. It's more like a craft, or it's like you're creating like it's a product. And so trying to get grants and funding and support for that is a lot more difficult. Like for my sponsors for this project, we because of the film and that aspect, we really pushed for this. It's more of an art installation than necessarily about the garments. So that was how we were able to get support for this project, the funding for that. But there are private groups that are obviously very interested in supporting both fashion and Indigenous cultural projects. So like Laura said, you just have to find those people that are willing to support you, and they're out there. There's definitely people who want to see more of this, and but it's always a challenge for artists to do any kind of get money for anything. And
So the last thing I wanted to ask you before maybe we open it up, because I'm sure there'll be some questions, is what do you think the kind of biggest, what do you think is the kind of greatest thing that an Indigenous or a Colombian perspective can offer to the kind of fashion industry as a whole? It's quite a big question.
But in a way, I think that there's a way. Because we all, like, Europe is like everything, it's kind of, you look from Colombia to Europe, like that's the way to do things.
Yeah.
So I think maybe now that the world is more like open, I think as creatives, like our challenge is how to be contemporary, and what works there can work in another part, but have like that local touch that Europe can't give us to us. So how to, and I think that's like the challenge as a brand or as a designer.
So you mean more kind of to start with what's local and to maybe appropriate aspects from Europe, or to take aspects rather than taking aspects from Europe and mixing it with a bit of what's at home?
Well, No, I think it's like we are part of the system and of the world. So it's more about like if you have the opportunity to come here or you present your collection in Paris or wherever, you know that it works like that. You can't ignore that. But then you have like you come from somewhere, so that's like and there's a specific context that I think that's what we can do from these kind of countries that hasn't like a fashion tradition at all. So how can we like start questioning those limits and those paradigms, like those paradigms. Yeah, I think that's like the challenge as a creative person from one of these countries that are not like where all people look at. Mm-hmm. But I think there is like the richness in that little space.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And what about you? Like, if there's kind of something that you think an Indigenous perspective could kind of offer?
Yeah, I think what I do with my work and how I present it is it's very slow fashion, and you know, traditionally we have that really deep connection to the things that we make and the materials that we gather and the relationships between each other and other artisans and other creatives and family members who are a part of making something, anything. I think this consumerist culture, people kind of, your connection to, your relationship to objects that you purchase can be very cold and like, you know, there's no, like, you don't feel a spiritual connection to things. You can. I think you really, really love something, it becomes really integral to you, and you'll have it for years. But there's a lot of just excessive waste of going to H&M and buying, you know, 10 T-shirts for like 50 quid. It's like, you know, you're going to forget about those T-shirts in a year. They're not special to you. Like I think the more that you can teach people to be involved in the process, or even just in the story of the things that you're buying, whether it's like I was talking about, like knowing where, you know, where that cotton or that wool was grown, and maybe if there's a name, like, you know how Lush puts you know, a face of the person who packaged that. Like there's just a personal, it creates some kind of personal connection to an object. Or like if you can influence people too to be, you know, collaborative in the way that, you know, more of a trading culture where, you know, I'm not saying everyone should learn how to sew and learn how to make things for themselves, but if you are somehow involved in the creation process, then that becomes more special to you. Or if you go to, you know, you come to me and say, I want to make a coat with you, and I'll say, okay, well, what do you want? Like, how do you want me? What do you want me to put into the coat that is, you know, part of me that then becomes part of you? And we have that relationship, we have that exchange, and then you feel like you've contributed to the creation of this piece. So then when you get it finally, you love it more and you have that spiritual connection to it. And then, you know, maybe you'll have it for 3 years or 5 years or 1 year, and you go, you know what, I think it's time to move on. I can part with it. But you've got to instill this desire to continue the story with this piece, like whether you pass it on to someone else, or maybe you take it, you could bring it back to me and say, can you alter this to do make something new out of it, or you get someone else to do it, and try to have an ongoing storyline with these things that are precious that we take from the land. Eventually, it's going to die and it's going to fall apart. Like I don't think, you know, like I have to be humble in the way that I make my garments, knowing that like it's not perfect. It's going to fall apart at some point, and at someday that is going to return back to the earth. And so I think these lessons and these beliefs are really ingrained in Indigenous culture, in their belief system. So they are consciously always thinking of materiality and the life that is a part of the whole, we're all connected to it. It's just it's a cycle. And so for me, that's what I'm trying to say, trying to get people to understand and believe in, and
yeah, okay. No, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of about maybe having a more holistic understanding of the fashion system, of how you make something, also kind of slowing down the pace at which we produce and consume fashion, and then also kind of about, like having confidence in sort of local identities and histories and how they can kind of push fashion forward. And then I suppose as like a fashion historian, I'm questioning like what kind of methodologies do we then need in order to study this type of fashion? Because the kind of Western-centric or Eurocentric methodologies kind of inevitably fall short. But that's probably another conversation. So for now, I wondered, if any of you have any particular questions you'd like to ask.
I'm an artist. I'm an artist, and the two things that come across to me that I recognise in the way that I work are the time and the narrative. And I think that the time that people can be so pressured if they become a brand, because you can't, you become very rigid. It immediately narrows you, and it quite often means that you don't have the time to develop the idea. So I think that the way that you're talking is trying to allow that sort of, to call it artistic. I don't want to call what you're doing art because it pigeonholes us all. But it's that type of working and allowing that to happen, which I think is really, really great to hear when one sees fashion turning over and so many shows a year and all this sort of thing. And I think the other thing is about narrative, again, but the narrative that is the hidden narrative that is deep in a culture, or one that you might not even recognize that you're working with, and then you see it later and you think, oh yes, that was happening. That's why that went in there. And these things happen when you're making a painting or a piece of something. And the way that you're talking about the clothes that you're making, you're talking the same way. And I find that really interesting, very inspiring, and something that would be fantastic if that was meshed in with the sort of things that, living in London, I'm used to seeing. So great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
You
Hello. Well, my name is Maria. I'm from Peru, so I also work with indigenous communities from there. So I'm actually wondering, because you're working with indigenous communities, do you provide any perhaps workshops to support communities? Because especially women's, I'm not sure in Colombia or in Canada, that they might face extreme poverty. So is there any programs that can help these artisans to develop their skills, or perhaps to get better opportunities as well? Because I know a lot of indigenous people, not all of them, but a few haven't been to school, which means that probably they may not have an education. So do you face any challenge with that with them, or do you provide any training? Just wondering, because we do, so because it's something that makes really important for them as well, in a way that they can develop their skills as well. Thanks.
Yes. Sure, the communities in Colombia is like in Peru. There are very precarious conditions, how they live. When I started working, I didn't think about making workshops, because I just wanted to know each other. And the truth is that I have learned more from them than I think them from me. But No, I think like how I faced that was just working with them. And when we start work, like they realized that they can, I don't know, they needed to have the spray for the house, like when there are like a lot of mosquitoes. How do you say that? Like fumigar? Well,
Bug repellents.
yeah, like exactly, fumigate, for example, that kind of things. And it's expensive for them to do that in their houses, for example. And when they realized that we start working, the first call was from the mother of one of the girls, and she was, "Oh, Laura, we're so happy that we can." They realized that through the beadswork, they could do that. Because half of the time they pick up coffee, but if the season is not like the good season for picking coffee, it's like they don't receive any money. So it's good, like they have like this part of the time they are working with the beadswork and the other with the coffee, so it makes a balance. And when they see that it works, they like a lot of things, they can improve a lot of things in their own community. So, and it's like, I think that's like to work together for me is like the best way of workshopping. Because I didn't want to go there and like be like a teacher or something like that, because it was just like we were meeting, like we were just knowing each other. And I think like everything has been working until now. It's because I've been like really like reading their needs and like in a intertext, like so. And I think the work is what encouraged them to improve their conditions.
Hi, this is a question for both of you, Laura and Curtis. So one of the topics that comes across different artists from the Mundo Latinx exhibition is representing different types of beauty, especially indigenous beauty, and looking away from beauty canons from Europe that comes from Europe and from the US. So I was wondering how you integrate that, if at all, within your practice and how you do it. Thank you.
Do you mean beauty in like individual?
So, for example, there are some artists from the exhibition that I'm not sure now if it's Dorian Ulysses or Gears, for example, is a model agency from Mexico, and they try to represent from indigenous people from Mexico to Black communities to the LGBT communities, but trying to show beauties that you wouldn't necessarily see within fashion catwalks, for example, or within, I don't know, social media brands. And and I was wondering if it's something that you consider within your practice when presenting your own work, if that makes sense.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think. Yes, totally. Because you become so used to see this kind of canonic beauty that in an unconscious way you start like everything has to be like that. But then you realize that it is not written anywhere. So then you said, why they can't be the models of their own creations? Yeah, so, and I think it's not written anywhere, so just do it, and that's what we are trying to do.
Yeah, challenge the notion of what beauty is. Well, I'll answer that more. I'm going to reinterpret that question to express what I talk about beauty. So I think a lot of things in indigenous culture and what we find beautiful, I think some people can find strange and grotesque, which I really thoroughly enjoy presenting and talking about, because hunting animals and skinning animals, tanning hides is a very messy, grotesque job. And especially in this world of people very conscious of fur and veganism, and people are very apprehensive of wearing these things now. But for us, it's very ingrained in our culture. We take everything from that animal and utilize it to its fullest extent, and we don't over hunt them. We don't take more than what we need. But it's part of us connecting to the land, and the things that we wear. Like I'm wearing this caribou antler and moose hide leather here, this earring, and we call this is our medicine that we carry with us. And to us it's beautiful, and to other people they get a little, they feel it very viscerally. Like we talked about bringing in a hand-tanned moose hide into the exhibit, and I decided that it was just one extra element that didn't need to be there. But when you hand tan, you tan these hides. They're massive hides, and you tan them, you brain tan them, and it's I've seen a deer hide being tanned, and it's gross. It's really makes you feel like whoa. But when it is finally tanned or smoked, it has a very strong, smoky, almost sour smell. And to a lot of people, that is grotesque. But to us, I think that's very beautiful. My last collection I did was titled Visceral Architecture, and it was inspired by these processes of peeling back the layers of skin and flesh. And it makes us, the idea of pulling a skin off an animal is it's very ugly, but it's also very beautiful. It's all a part of this, this miraculous machine that is an animal body, a human body, any living thing. How can of course that's very beautiful. That life and death, growing and then returning back to the land, and decay and rot. That it makes us uncomfortable and sick to think about it. It triggers our senses. But that whole process is beautiful, and I try to display that as much as I can. Try to find that balance between disturbing and desire and intriguing, I guess.
And it's also, I think that it's, as designers, it's our responsibility, and is now to also break down those paradigms. Paradigms of beauty, because if you know that there's and there's so many other beauties, and maybe someone is not gonna like it, but you don't do clothes for everybody. Let's do it. And it's in our hands, so we are responsible also of that, of how we manage and how we communicate our clothes.
Curtis, I remember us talking last summer about cultural appropriation and people from outside of a community accessing its heritage. And I think you were really strongly saying, but that doesn't mean that people shouldn't come and learn. And I just wondered what your advice would be to people who do want to kind of research or find out more, or without having that thing of taking and not knowing enough to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a huge advocate for, I'm constantly talking about exchange, cultural exchange, because that's how culture evolves, is when we trade with one another and share our ideas and our beliefs and work together and collaborate. And I think, people being aware of cultural appropriation is a really good thing to be conscious of now, because it's been happening for, the colonizers, the Europeans have been, they take from indigenous nations. They've been doing it for centuries, and so it's the fact that now we're saying, hey, that's not cool anymore. It's great, but it's also created a bit of a fear in people that they're going to get in trouble, or and so people are interested in participating, but they say, well, I'm white, I can't, I'm not allowed to. So the best way to do that is to buy from the artisans and to visit with them and create a dialogue and talk to them, ask them questions. And if you want to create, if you're an artist or a designer and you want to create within that sphere, then you have to go through the right avenue. So that just means that you go to someone of that culture and you work with them and you collaborate with them, and then you accredit them and you properly say, like, I was inspired by this community in Colombia, and I went there and I worked with them and they did the beadwork, like exactly what Laura's doing.
And how you communicate it.
How you communicate it.
I'm not gonna put in the tag Laura Lawrence. I'm gonna say Embera Chami, which is the community, plus Laura, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just as easy as, just talking about it. And the more that we talk about it, the more people will understand. And so it's like if you're wearing, a beaded earring or, I think people are afraid to even wear it because they think that they're not allowed to wear it. But if you went to that artist and bought it, then of course you can, because then you can talk to when people see that what you're wearing and they ask you about it, then it's continuing the conversation and they're going to pass it on, and then they'll feel okay to go purchase something. But there's one thing being inspired by the culture. If you just look at something in a book and you go, oh, that inspired me, and then you go take that, that's a little different. I don't think there's an exact science to doing this, but talking about it and just being honest about it is key. Yeah.
I just thought it might be quite interesting to bring this conversation back to when we were both talking earlier about using kind of shamanic elements in your work, and kind of going back to that and thinking about cultural appropriation and where it becomes problematic, where it's kind of sometimes using elements that should be sacred and then it's being brought in different ways, and kind of it's interesting looking at ideas of using shamanic symbology or shamanic ideas of like the garment as kind of fetish or totem, and kind of how bringing that into fashion as kind of the consumer-led space, kind of how that all integrates. I think that's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually I had that worry in a moment, and I talked with one of the grandfathers of the community about that, because I told him, what do you think when we co-create this and then I go to Bogota to my studio and then this travels to, New York or whatever, and he told me, no, for me it's, at least for this community, it's a honor, because each piece for us, and we don't do like massive production. We make limited editions of this part of the collection, because it will be not, we couldn't have like the capacity of response to make like a massive production. So he told me, for me, it's like a way of sharing my knowledge and our like medical and shamanic energy into the world. So they are like more than happy every time that I take the pieces out of the community and then they start like being part of this fashion. But the way, like to have like this limited thing, and because we have developing a relationship, it's not like it loses its meaning, so it becomes like someone somewhere else, we don't know where, it's gonna have that. And he's like, and he told me, and he's like the ram, like he has like the shamanic powers in the community. And he told me, no, for me this is just like amazing, but because he knows like the chain, he knows how it is going from one to the other. So yeah, and I also had like that question mark in my mind once, and I asked him, and he told me, no, Laura, this is a privilege for us, and it's a way of sharing, and it's our language too. So it's like, because at least the bead knitting, it means like knitting the path through the neck. So the bigger the piece, the more powerful and the more meaningful for them. So when you get older, you get more wise and more, so the pieces. So if you're lucky to have that piece, well, it will be like your. So I think it's one world. So in that way, it's.
Yeah. The way I like to talk about my pieces is we kind of call it urban regalia. So like traditionally regalia is made for ceremonial and like traditional celebrations, but the meanings that go into like that is in every material that you have, like that what we wear and we carry with us is constant. It's always there, and it would be different if you wore an eagle feather in your hair every day, because an eagle feather is extremely sacred and very, very ceremonial. But if you're wearing leather, you're wearing cotton, you're wearing things from the earth, that is all spiritual energy transference, and you carry that with you. And so when I wear this piece, I'm carrying that energy of the animals that their spirit is within that, my spirit is within this, and it's kind of it's medicinal, and you're allowed to wear that constantly. And if you're thinking about it, it's if it's on your mind, then it becomes more powerful and stronger. And for my pieces, so I'm not actually, my brand isn't, I don't, through this whole process I've decided that I don't fit into the fashion industry the same way that a lot of the other brands do, because I work in a more bespoke manner and more collaborative with people. So like there's more purpose and intent in the pieces that I create. And there's a bit of a performative aspect to the pieces, as you can see, like the orange coat with the horse hair. And so to Indigenous dress and what they like to create is fringe is very apparent, and that's for a reason, because whether it's leather or whether it's horsehair or maybe it's cedar bark or what have you, like those tendrils connect you to when you're walking through the forest. You're connecting to the medicines. They're like antennas that are like drawing this bridge between you and the land, or to the people that you're talking to. And I have this, when people say like, you wear the clothes don't wear you. Like I kind of have a bit of an opposite philosophy, where the clothes can have their own spirit and their own energy, and they are their own entity. And sometimes when you put that on, it controls you, and it makes you feel something that is like out of your own body, and that's like a really exciting thing for a lot of people, because when they put that coat on and they feel that fringe and that horsehair, they want to move and they want to perform. They feel something really special. And so, from a shamanistic point of view, I think like it's a little different. It's about that medicine. We call it medicine, and you're adopting the qualities of the form of life of those materials, and it's constant. And if people can think about that wherever they go, like I think about this cotton shirt, and I don't know where the cotton came from, but someone grew that, and it had a story and had a life, and I'm carrying that with me. And it's better to know the story, so that you're not going in blind.
Was there a question? Yeah, over here.
Apologies.
Sorry.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask something in the direction of the question before about the shamanic ways of what you're doing, or how this kind of relates to maybe these narratives which come with the stories of your communities. Are these narratives you're going to communicate to your buyers as well, or will this kind of stay in the back? Is this what kind of gets purified when the articles or your products enter the actual fashion market? Will you kind of cut these narratives away from the actual garments, or are the garments kind of standing for the narratives?
Sorry, what's the question?
If you kind of communicate the narratives to your buyers, or if these narratives, the shamanic powers or healing medicinal kind of stories behind them, then the garments will stay.
Yeah, for me, the people I want to work with, like my next project I'm working on is doing the costumes for this ongoing research-based conceptual dance project. I'm working with the choreographer, so I'm working intimately with the choreographer and the dancers to develop the pieces. And they came to me because, aesthetically, they saw something. They saw maybe it looked a little Victorian, or there was something costumey about it. But then you look closer, it's more complex than that. And then as they read up on my philosophies and my design ethos, they really connected to that, because what they were doing through their dance and their research was there's a similar strain. This is here in London, and so. These are the kind of projects that I like to work on, and because I want to have a connection to my client. I don't want to say client because it's too professional. I don't know. I'm creating relationships with the people that are going to take my pieces, and so it is an ongoing dialogue. Like I want to make sure that I'm touching the garment and I'm handing it to them. And I want to know who's having it. So I'm a little different in the sense I'm not sending my garments off to a factory, and I'm not sending them to a store to put on a hanger and for me to never meet the person who's going to wear it. So for me, it's very important that the people know what's happening with this exchange. But it's different and maybe for Laura.
Yeah, because maybe someone buy the clothes for. It's not like that personalized. Well, I have my workshop in Bogota, and it's personalized, but just in my studio. But then if that piece travels to another place, well, the message is there, but I know that the clothes that we make, it's for a niche. It's not like for a huge group. So I also like, there's the message, but I also like when the clothes during time start revealing these other messages. So yes, we put the information, but it's not like it's there. And then these people, if they engage the brand, they start discovering like the other things. But it's a suggestion. It's maybe not like I don't want like to be boring, to bore people also with like something really. But then if you engage it and you like the brand, it's a conversation also with that and how to discover all these other layers.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.